Have you back on episode 3. In the last episode, I mentioned briefly on the righteousness of God. And I said that because God is righteous, is the reason why He's able to reckon all men as righteous, but only by faith. And today's episode, we're going to start from that phrase in Romans chapter 1, verse 17. I'm just going to quickly read that to us. Romans chapter 1, verse 17 says, "For in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith." So that phrase there in verse 17, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed." The righteousness of God. And I want to just explain what that means in context and how that is important to understanding the book of Romans. You see, when Paul said the righteousness of God, in that particular verse, what it meant or how it should be interpreted is this: to say how God explains righteousness, how God defines righteousness, what the true definition of God's righteousness is. So in context, if we read from verse 17, verse 15 rather, where Apostle Paul said that that is why I am so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are in Rome, because I am not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes, first to the Jews and then to the Gentile. Take note, he's talking about the gospel. I'm eager to share the gospel to you. This gospel is so transformative. It brings salvation to the Jew and to the Greek. So he's still talking about the gospel, and then we go into verse 17. He says, "For in the gospel." So in this gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. In the gospel, the definition of God's righteousness is revealed. In the gospel, how God describes righteousness is being revealed. And now the question is, how does God define righteousness? He says, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith. So Apostle Paul is saying to his readers that in the gospel we find the perfect definition of God's righteousness. If you were ever going to ask God, how do you define righteousness? What does righteousness mean? God's righteousness is that righteousness before me is attained by faith. So the definition of God's righteousness is that righteousness is by faith. So having said that in verse 17, what you see thereafter, like we already talked about in the last episode, where our major focus was to establish that all have sinned. Then Apostle Paul then goes on from verse 18 to show how every human has sinned. And then he explains how in chapter 2, how the Jews, these were the ones that had the law, these were the descendants of Abraham, descendants of Moses, how despite they had the law, they sinned. You see that in Romans chapter 2, which is part of this letter as well. And then in Romans chapter 1, he also explained how people who were not Jews, who are referred to as Gentiles, how despite they did not have the law, they also sinned. Because you see, and Apostle Paul explained how they sinned. And I'm going to just quickly touch on that. So people who did not have the law then, who were not Jews, how did they sin? They sinned in the sense that they rejected God. How did they reject God? Apostle Paul lets us know that in the creation of the world, God designed the world in a way that it's going to be very difficult for anyone to say that there is no God. Have you ever experienced this where you see someone's work? Maybe you are someone who is fascinated by art, and then you see you see a piece of art, and then you can just tell even before you see the name and say, this is the person that did this. I was talking to my wife recently, and then she was telling me about how there's a particular fashion designer that when she sees the person's work, she can almost tell that this was the person. So in that same way, Apostle Paul said God created the world in such a fantastic way, in such a divine way, that it would take a lot of intentionality for you to say there is no divinity here, that you can't sense the hands of divinity. So that's the same way that people who, despite did not have the law, despite they did not know thou shalt not, could not tell but know that there is a God. And rather than them giving him the glory, rather than them accepting, even if you don't come to the full grasp of his definition, like the Jews would have done, like the Jews who knew him as Yahweh, they could at least have just acknowledged in their heart that there is a God. But Apostle Paul said that these people did not. And in rejecting that revelation, in rejecting that definition, rejecting who God is, Apostle Paul said God gave them over. So they now had a new expression. They opened their hearts to some sort of perversion whereby sin had came, and that's how they also sinned. But now, so you find, so this is the flow of thought. Jews have sinned, Gentiles have sinned. So even if you were to attain righteousness by works, you can't attain it because you have both sinned. But regardless, the definition of God's righteousness is by faith. So that's the flow of thought. That's what Apostle Paul is telling his readers from Romans chapter 1 to Romans chapter 3. All have sinned, and God's definition of righteousness is that righteousness is by faith. So that's what you say. That I wanted to point that out. So if you then go to Romans chapter 3 from verse 25, Romans chapter 3 verse 25, you see another presentation of God's righteousness. So anywhere you see that phrase, God, the righteousness of God, from Romans chapter 1 to Romans chapter 3, in context, what Apostle Paul was talking about was how God defines righteousness. But then we see another use of that phrase in Romans chapter 3 from from verse 25. It says, God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through the shedding of his blood to be received by faith. He did this to demonstrate his righteousness. I know you might say that was God's righteousness. This is saying his righteousness. It's still the same phrase. Who is the is here is God, to demonstrate God's righteousness. But in this case, the proper context of God's righteousness here has to do with an active tense. In other words, how God showed he was righteous. The former one we're talking about was how God defines righteousness. But in this case, how God showed that he was righteous. And how did God do that? How did God demonstrate to the world that is righteous? By offering Jesus Christ, by presenting Jesus Christ. You see, like we said, the people Apostle Paul wrote to, they were Jews. There were Jews among them. You see, for you as a Christian in present day, you might see saying he presented Christ as an atonement as just a metaphor, just a metaphor. But in their own time, though it was a metaphor, it had a practical experience in the sense that in Judaism, they would always offer the blood of bulls. So in the law of Moses, you have the high priest, for example, Aaron. When the people come to ask God for forgiveness, when they come every year, there was that feast. They will bring the blood of animals and then he will slaughter it for himself and then sprinkle the blood just to, sanctify the people, just as a way of their sins being forgiven, and then they'll bring the goat. So that use of Christ as an atonement that Paul says in Romans chapter 3 verse 25 had a practical expression. And Apostle Paul is now saying that for God to demonstrate his righteousness, he did that to Jesus. So God had to prove his own righteousness by offering Jesus Christ. And Apostle Paul said the reason why he had to do that was because the original sin. What is the original sin? The sin that Adam committed. The Bible said God had not punished it. But now, in offering Jesus Christ, God had now punished the sin of Adam. And in doing that, God demonstrated his righteousness. Active tense. And that's another thing to know as we understand the book of Romans. So, having done that, so this is definition of God's righteousness. Now, God has demonstrated his righteousness. Now, God now establishes a new law to say that in the first place, you could not meet the righteousness of the law. Now, this is my definition. Righteousness is by faith. I have done what you could not do. I have demonstrated my righteousness, and I have now established a new law that for you to be righteous, it has to be by faith. By faith in who? By faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That is the explanation we find of Romans chapter 1 from Romans chapter 3. So once you now get into Romans chapter 4, Apostle Paul now went on further to let them know that this law, as it were, isn't exactly a new law because righteousness has always been by faith. And he used the example of Abraham, that Abraham lived before the law, yet Abraham was considered righteous. What did Abraham do, or what did Abraham not do for him to be righteous? The Bible let us know in Genesis chapter 12 that Abraham believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. So Apostle Paul's aim from Romans chapter 1 to Romans chapter 5 is to prove to these readers that righteousness, the definition of God's righteousness, is by faith.
And that faith and that definition has been in existence even long before the law was given, despite the fact that even if men were to go by the law, they could not have fulfilled the law. I hope you get this. So that's what we see in Romans chapter 1 to Romans chapter 4. In Romans chapter 4, it uses the example of, of Abraham. So I'll just leave you here and then we'll catch up again on the next episode. But as a bonus point for today, with this understanding, I want you to now read Romans chapter 4, and I'll see you on the next episode. Bye.